Well, welcome everyone to today's webinar. Today we'll be discussing power wheelchair alternative driving methods. This is one of my favorite topics in assistive technology. I see a fair amount of people for power wheelchair assessment, and most of the clients I work with are unable to use a standard joystick, so oftentimes we're looking at a variety of access options. So as we go through this, feel free to pop any comments or questions into the chat box. This is an hour-long course. We could talk about this topic for days. There's a tremendous amount of info. So this is designed to be an overview. You also do have some handouts, though, that go through some of this info in a little more detail. And if you're more interested in this topic, I can certainly provide further resources. So again, thanks for joining us, and let's jump in. Well, I should say, too, I'm Michelle. I'm an occupational therapist in the Denver, Colorado area. And again, this is one of the things I do in my job is I do evaluate clients for power mobility. So today we'll be discussing some of the power wheelchair driving methods that are on the market. And as we do so, we're going to use a decision-making hierarchy to help us move through these various options, kind of starting at the top with what you might first look at, depending on the client's abilities, and then moving on through. Again, you have handouts that go through this as well. Some things to keep in mind that are beyond the scope of this course here today that do impact the ability of someone to successfully use an alternative driving method include being optimally positioned within their base. Very, very important. If someone is just thrown into an evaluation chair and they do not have the postural support and stability they need, this client may not be successful with driving. We need to do a thorough power wheelchair assessment, including determining whether the client is ready to drive a power wheelchair. Look at the drive wheel configuration, whether it's front, mid, or rear wheel drive, and determining if that's the best option for a client. Tracking technologies are available on all of these complex rehab power chairs, and these technologies smooth out the driving process so that the client requires less movements of the joystick or less switch activations to get from one point to another. It keeps the chair on track. There's a lot of programming that can be done to the power chair to customize it to an individual's needs. And then finally, mobility training. Now, some of these are topics we've addressed in other courses as well. I would invite you to check out what's available on the ABLEnet library on demand. So with that, we're going to start with proportional driving methods. Proportional driving methods are also called analog, and these are primarily some form of joystick. When using proportional control, the client has 360 degrees of directional control, as well as speed control. With a joystick, typically the further the joystick is deflected from center, the faster the chair goes. And this is versus non-proportional or digital driving methods, and we'll touch on those in a little bit. Now, proportional joystick control requires a couple things on the part of the client, and this can be more difficult than we realize. If you haven't had a chance to drive a joystick controlled power wheelchair, I would encourage you to try to do so. See if you can get a joystick on loan, get it in service, hop in that power chair and try this out. It's not as easy as a lot of people think, and that helps us to understand the task better for the clients we work with. So to use this joystick, we have to be able to grade the force and distance of our movement. That means I have to balance muscles like my flexors and my extensors in my arm. And if I can't do so, I may not be able to reach out, accurately grasp the joystick, and control it within that 360 degrees of movement. This grading of the force and distance of my movement is particularly difficult for clients who have abnormal muscle tone. So clients with diagnoses such as cerebral palsy or traumatic brain injury often struggle with joystick use. So if the client does have this ability to grade the force and distance of their movement, they may be able to successfully use a standard joystick. If not, we typically have to look at digital or non-proportional options. We also have to make sure that the client has adequate movement and motor control to use this joystick. If the client doesn't have adequate motor control or the ability to move, perhaps due to muscle strength or other coordination issues, then we may have to look at a non-proportional option. We next have to look at if the client can optimally control a standard joystick that's mounted at the end of the arm pad. Now, typically, a joystick is mounted to the end of the arm pad, usually on the right side. It's because most of us are right-handed, and it's because by placing the joystick there, it gets it out of the way for transfers. However, I think often in this industry, we are guilty of trying to make the client fit the equipment instead of modify the equipment to best match the client's needs. If the client struggles with this position, we can look at alternative placements. So if the end of that arm pad doesn't work, we can look at a more midline placement. So there's several mounts out there that let us position the joystick anywhere from the end of the joystick all the way into midline. This can be placed on either arm pad, and this way we have that full range in front of the client, and that might better match where their needs are. Another strategy we can do is look at the angle. Many of the clients we work with are not pushing their hand directly forward of their body. Their hand might cross over their body, and their forearm might turn a bit. If that's the case, we can angle the joystick in the two planes shown here. The challenge with doing that is for a lot of clients, when I've had to change the angle of the joystick, someone will come along and fix it for me. And so it's important that everyone understand that it's at that location, at that specific angle, to match someone's needs and not to get in there and change it up. I've been known to actually label things and say it's crooked on purpose. If the client has difficulty grasping a standard joystick handle, there are a variety of handles on the market. Now, for all the handles that are out there, I gotta let you know that I don't use these very often. The one that I mostly use is the goalpost style handle that you see here. And this is helpful for people who don't have a good grasp. It's typically used by someone who has a lower cervical spinal cord injury and perhaps can operate that joystick but can't grasp it. The other handles are not often as useful. If I'm finding that I'm trying numerous different handles, chances are that the client is having more difficulty with the task of using a joystick, and the handle may not be the best solution. Next, we need to ask ourselves, is there adequate room to mount a standard joystick where it's required for the client to have optimal control? So if the client can use a joystick, but perhaps it needs to be kind of close to their body, or perhaps this is a young client or a client of short stature, the standard joysticks take up quite a bit of room. Fortunately, we also have compact joysticks that are available to us. These take up a lot less space. There's several companies that make these compact joysticks, and it increases our mounting options. So now we can get that joystick in a position where we otherwise couldn't. Now, those larger joysticks have a lot of buttons and dials and displays on them, and we might lose some of that when we move to these compact joysticks. So we need to keep in mind that we might need a different strategy for the client to change the mode of operation of the chair, let's say from driving to something else like controlling a power tilt. And we may need another way for them to control power. On this one compact joystick pictured here, There are two switches on either side. One of these is for power, and one is to change the mode, sometimes called a mode or reset switch on the joystick. This particular compact joystick, the Movis, is programmable, and actually we can change the functions of these two switches as it best meets someone's needs. I'll try to get to our next slide. Here we go. Next, we need to ask ourselves, does the client have adequate force to initiate movement of the joystick and sustain the joystick in a deflected position to keep the chair moving? If the client has no problem with that, they can probably use a standard joystick. But if a client struggles with this task, they may require a mini proportional joystick. Mini proportional joysticks are one of the primary proportional alternative driving methods that we have. Mini joysticks require less active force and travel in order to activate them and thus move the chair. So a standard joystick takes about 250 grams of force. That doesn't mean very much to my brain, but in comparison to that, there are many of these mini proportional joysticks that require about 50 grams of force, and another category of mini proportionals that require about 10 grams of force. Now, these can be used in multiple locations, but mini proportional joysticks are most frequently used at a finger or at the chin. The minis that require about 50 grams of force are more commonly used at the chin because we've got more leverage. We're moving our whole head. And these extremely sensitive little joysticks that require about 10 grams of force are more commonly used at a finger or thumb. Now, you might run into a client who can control a mini proportional joystick by their finger or thumb, but needs that driving method close into their body, midline and close to their body. We have a very unique option for this scenario, and it is a game control, drive control. SwitchIt has taken a standard game control that you'd use, say, for a video game, and they've modified it for driving. Now, this really works well for clients that have diagnoses like Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. People with Duchenne do best holding something close into their body in midline. Many of these young men, as they approach their teen years, have difficulty using a standard joystick. They lose the strength required to control that standard joystick, but can still play their video games at home. This particular game control has two little mini joysticks built right in. They require about 40 to 50 grams of force, and this can be used to control driving and other power wheelchair features. So this is another unique option for people who need a mini joystick. Now, as with all of these alternative driving methods, one of the things we really have to keep in mind is how are we going to mount this technology? We can mount these mini joysticks by the hand or by the head, like by the chin, but that requires some specific equipment, and it's very important to keep all of this in mind. The team that is evaluating a client and determining the best alternative driving method is going to recommend not only the driving method, but whatever is required to mount it and support the client in relation to it. So if we are placing a mini joystick by the chin, then we have a couple different options. There are some mounts that swing out of the way. They're attached to the wheelchair. That means that this mini proportional joystick stays in relation to the client's chin in direct relation to the wheelchair. So if the client is moving along, okay, I just need to verify that you guys can hear me because I just got a weird Thank you. Okay, sorry about that. So yes, people can hear me, so thank you very much. So if we are placing a joystick by the chin, and we place it on a swing away mount that's attached to the wheelchair, and the client is bumping around in their seat a little bit over a bumpy sidewalk, they may move out of alignment with the joystick. If we instead mount the joystick on a harness or bib, then the joystick stays in relation to the client. But the client's kind of stuck with this joystick by their chin all the time. They can't move it out of the way. If the client is able to use a swing away mount and needs to independently get it out of the way, then there is a power mount available from one company called Motion Concepts. There's another power mount available out of Belgium that's distributed in the United States through Stealth Products, and it's from a company called Movis. Now, if we're mounting one of these cute little mini proportional joysticks by the hand, we are assuming that this is a client who has muscle weakness. So their movements are going to be quite small without a lot of force, and it's very important to support the entire forearm and hand. So mounting becomes really, really important. So you can see here, this joystick is mounted within a hand tray. It allows the client to rest their entire hand on this surface and then control the joystick. The height of the joystick can be adjusted in relation to the top of the tray to accommodate how the client is using the joystick. We can also mount this right at the end of a wider arm pad or arm trough to support the arm or within a tray. So just remember, it's really important for someone using a mini joystick that it's not just hanging out in space, that the hand and forearm are well supported. Okay, so we're going to stop for some questions before we talk about non-proportional options. And Ruth has asked a question about, do you have resource information on using power wheelchair control for access to alternative technologies such as communication devices or computer? There are definitely resources on that. So I'm trying to think. I might have done a webinar on that for AbleNet in the past, and you can look in the library to see if that's the case. There's also a new textbook available. It came out about a year ago, and I'll be showing that towards the end of this course today. And there's a whole chapter in there on advanced features of power wheelchairs, and that is one of the things they can do. If you have a specific client in mind and you want to try that out, I would recommend, too, that you work with a supplier and or the manufacturer representative for that particular chair and ask them to help you try that out with a client. All right. Any other questions or comments people have about proportional controls? Feel free to type those into the chat box. I know we're going through this really fast, lots of information. This is just a general overview, and very happy to answer any questions. All right. Not seeing any more questions right now. If you are typing, please keep typing, and I will grab those as we move along. All right, so we've talked about proportional alternative drive access methods, and there's several out there. The main one are these mini proportional joysticks that provide that proportional control. So we're going to move on to non-proportional driving methods, sometimes called digital, and these basically use some form of switch. Now, again, you have two different handouts in addition to the PDF of the PowerPoint today, and one of those is a decision-making tree for these proportional access methods. The other is for these non-proportional, and that will support some of the information that I'm sharing today. So let's say you're working with a client who really can't use any type of joystick. Again, joystick control requires that grading of force and movement, and that can be difficult for some clients, or the client just simply may not have enough movement or motor control to use any type of joystick. In that case, we jump into a new hierarchy. The first thing we need to consider is if the client has fair upper extremity control, we might be able to take some mechanical switches and place them on the surface of a tray, as we've done for this young man here. And the client can simply reach out and push the switches, and each switch represents a discrete direction. So in this case, this young man has 3 switches on his tray. He's pushing the forward one. He also has a switch for left and a switch for right. So we can represent those directions with a power chair to allow someone to do some driving. Now, there might be a client who has fair upper extremity control who could move their hand over the location where one of those mechanical switches is on a tray, but perhaps can't get their hand up and over the surface of the switch in order to activate it. This is particularly difficult for clients with increased tone. That client might be able to slide their arm side to side or forward and back over a specific location, but may not be able to get up and over on a switch and release it readily to stop. In those cases, we can take proximity switches and actually place them underneath a tray. So here you can see we have a picture of some proximity switches. They are actually placed within a tray. Here's an older style proximity switch. You can see we've got some yellow ones here underneath this young man's tray. And these again accommodate fair upper extremity control, not real precise upper extremity control. They accommodate larger movement, and we're eliminating a plane of movement by placing these switches underneath the surface of the tray. These are capacitive switches, and in layman's terms, they measure our capacity to conduct electricity. And so if our hand moves over the surface of the tray, the switch will activate. If you put your math book on top of the surface of the tray, the switches will not activate. However, if your cat jumps up on the tray, it will activate, or a glass of milk on top of the tray will activate the switches. So this is something to keep in mind with the type of switches these are. But with that said, I work with a number of clients who have fair upper extremity control, not enough control for a joystick, who might have difficulty with mechanical switches on the surface of the tray, but may be able to use these proximity switches underneath the tray. Corey has asked, why is there no back or reverse button on that young man I showed a picture of a second ago? I'll go back here. He's just starting to drive. We're doing an evaluation here, and we wanted to get a sense of how he would do with forward, left, and right. And I often do not add a reverse switch right away. I want to see how the child will do, since this is a brand new experience for him, before I add in reverse to the task. So again, these are proximity switches. They're the same switches that are found in the head array, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. So continuing along in our hierarchy, we're actually going to back up a little bit back into the proportional world. If you're working with a client who has good fine motor control, but limited activation, travel, and force, and let's say that they really are having difficulty with a mini proportional joystick, then one of our options is a touchpad. Another option are fiber optic switches. So this is a touchpad. It's from Switchit, which is underneath the Sunrise Medical umbrella of products. And it uses a screen that's pretty much the same as the screen on our smartphones. You just simply drop your finger into the center of the screen, and as you move it in any direction, that's where the chair will move. Some clients are able to use this who might have difficulty with a mini proportional joystick. It does still provide proportional control, meaning that if I can draw a circle with my finger on the surface of the screen, That's what the chair is going to do, is drive in a circle, and the farther from center I move, the faster the chair will move. A non-proportional option that captures very small movements is the fiber optic switch arrays. So fiber optic switches work by emitting a beam of fiber optic light. When that light encounters an obstacle, such as a finger, it's reflected back along the cable, and that's what activates the switch. These are designed to capture very, very small movements, and like proximity switches, is an electronic switch. It draws power from the power wheelchair and does not require any force. And so this works very well for clients who have muscle weakness. This is often used by people who have a condition like ALS or spinal muscular atrophy. The cables are very fragile. They break easily. And so mounting, again, is a big deal with fiber optics. These can be mounted, for example, in this tray, in a hand pad, in an arm trough, wherever the mechanism, the switch itself, can be well protected and the cables can be well protected. In this tray, all the cables are housed inside this hollow tray, and there's a cover underneath to protect things. And a more robust cable comes out of the tray. So again, this is something where the evaluation team would very carefully look at where these switches need to go to best meet an individual's needs. Beth Ann, I see your hand is raised. If you have a question or comment, if you could just type that into the chat box, that would be great. So if we have ruled out both more larger movements of the upper extremity or very fine movements of the finger or thumb, then further down our hierarchy, we go to clients who may have fair head control, but little control of their extremities, their arms and legs. And the most common driving method for these clients is the head array. So the head array has been around for a long time now. It consists of those proximity switches that we looked at earlier that can be put in a tray, but these proximity switches are now placed into a headrest. And these early headrests consisted of this tri-pad arrangement. There's hinges in between these pads. There's a proximity switch in each of them. If the client moves their head back towards the proximity switch in this rear pad, the chair drives forward, and then there's a switch for left and right. If the client can keep their head in contact with the rear pad while simultaneously hitting a side pad, they get a more subtle turn. If the client only activates the side pad, which requires them to come off the back pad a little bit, they get a more discrete turn, a sharper turn. This can be handy if someone's going down a long hallway. They can keep their head in contact with the rear pad and just simply correct their course by turning their head slightly side to side. This works well for clients with fair to good head control. Don't have to have really fine head control to use this. There are a lot of manufacturers of these head arrays. Matter of fact, in January, I taught a course that was an hour long on just head arrays. We compared the 8 available models that are on the market. There's quite a difference between each of these, but again, the evaluating team can make that decision on which is the most appropriate. Each of these have different configurations and different features. Many of our newer options, instead of having simply a hinge here on the tri-pad style head support, have a swing away mechanism here with much more precise adjustment to better meet someone's need. Okay, we're going to take a look at a video. This is Jonathan, and I'll show you the video here in just a second. Jonathan was trying a head array. We were inside the building of a supplier in my area, and he drove really, really well. He drove right to the entrance door of this building 5 times in a row. So we finally put on our coats and went outside because it was a cold day. And he proceeded to drive around the parking lot We were videotaping him because his dad was deployed and he wanted to show him a video of how well he had done. So here is Jonathan trying out the head array.
For posterity, okay? There you go. And I can send this to Mom, and she can show everyone how awesome a driver you are. You're doing really, really well.
Don't run away, Jonathan.
Well, as much as he was intentionally trying to get out of the building, I think he's avoiding the ramp now. Yeah.
Where are you going?
You're on TV, bud. You're doing great.
Jonathan, over here.
Good. You gonna drive to Mom?
Hey. Jonathan.
Jonathan, I'm going to take the wheel for a second because this truck...
And we had to stop his driving there for a moment because an 18-wheeler decided to go right down the middle of that parking lot, and we needed to move Jonathan out of the way. It didn't look like the truck was stopping. So the head array is probably one of our most common alternative driving methods. It is non-proportional. It works very well, again, for clients who may have good, fair to good head control, but not a lot of control over their arms and legs. Now, you might be working with a client who has good oral motor control, but little head or extremity control. And this is most commonly seen in clients with a higher level spinal cord injury, and those clients often use sip and puff. Sip and puff's been around for a really long time, but it works quite well for clients, and so it's still very commonly used by people with a high level spinal cord injury. You do have to have good oral motor control, meaning you can keep your lips sealed and you have an intact soft palate, because otherwise the air will escape. You really have to maintain air pressure within the mouth. If you can't maintain air pressure, you can't use sip and puff. This isn't really breath control, breathing control. Lots of people who use sip and puff use a ventilator. It's air pressure within the mouth, and this provides full directional control as well as speed control. So traditionally, this is control with 4 commands. A hard puff, hard pressure built within the mouth, results in forward movement of the chair. Soft puff turns to the right. A hard sip turns reverse on, activates reverse, and a soft sip is left. Now, an important feature in sip and puff is something called latch. So this is typically activated with a hard puff. The chair will continue moving forward without continued activation by the client, because it's too hard to maintain that for a long period of time. If the client wants to stop, they simply give a reverse command, that hard sip, and it will stop the chair. And speeds can be controlled in a number of ways. It varies by the wheelchair electronic system and how it's programmed, but typically someone can give repeated hard puffs, and that will ramp up the speed for the driver. There's also a combination system out there that accommodates people who have some of this good oral motor control and some head control and need a combination of a head array and a sip and puff. So in this case, left and right is controlled by the head array. Any puff is forward, any sip is reverse. This might work well for clients who get stuck on that rear pad of the head array. A lot of clients, if they're startled or excited, have a lot of extension and might have trouble releasing the back pad of the head array to stop. There's also clients who have difficulty discriminating between those hard and soft pneumatic commands, the hard and soft puff, hard and soft sip. This allows any puff to be forward, any sip to be reverse. Now, sometimes we can look at all these various driving methods, and there's a lot of them, and there's some that we're not even touching on today that are less common. But despite all of our options, we sometimes just have to pull out some switches, and we have to put on our detective hat and determine, where does this client have control? Where can I put switches so that they're able to successfully drive themselves? So what we might need to do is choose for forward, left, right, reverse, mechanical or electrical switches, and figure out where to place them for that client, where the client has small, isolated, repeatable, and sustained ability to activate and release a switch. Now this is tricky, and I have done some webinars for ABLEnet, and you can certainly look in the library there that address how do you figure out where to put a switch on a client, and how do you know which switch to use. So I would encourage you to check those out if you are in search of that information. But if we think our client can operate a switch at 4 discrete spots on their body, this is possible to do. Ideally, we want to start with at least 3 switch sites, forward, left, and right. The strongest switch site needs to be forward because that's what the client's going to use most frequently. If we can find a 4 switch site, then that can be reversed, but it can also fill another feature, and that can be reset or a mode switch. It's the same switch, just 2 different terms that are used. It changes the mode of operation of the chair. So typically a chair is in driving mode. I hit my reset or mode switch and I tell it I want to do something else, like control my power tilt system, for example, or control reverse. So that 4 switch site gives me the function of reverse as well as other functions as well. And it requires the least amount of motor control because I don't have to hit my reset switch at a specific time. I don't have to hold it down. I don't have to release it at a specific time. And so if I'm looking at 4 switch sites on my client's body, I want the best switch site, the one they have the most control over, to be forward, and the one they have the least control over, I can make reset. So let's look at an example. This is Faith, and Faith is a young woman I had the opportunity to work with a number of years ago, and she's still driving very, very well. So Faith had a power chair. It had a joystick on it. Oh, let me get my pointer again. But she wasn't able to control the joystick. And then someone else came along and decided maybe Faith could use a head array, but unfortunately they didn't try it with her, and when it arrived, she wasn't able to use the head array either. The main reason is that Faith tends to stabilize with her head. She needs to keep her head in contact with this head support all the time. But we did find some switch sites for her. We found that Faith could pull her arm back and hit a jelly bean switch behind her left upper arm, and that allowed her to drive forward. She was able to hold the switch, this is a spec switch on a strap base, in her left hand and squeeze it to turn to the left. And at the time of the evaluation, she was using another jelly bean by the medial side of her left knee. She obviously has more control over the left side of her body. But it took a while for all of her equipment to arrive, and by the time it did, she decided she wanted to try a switch in her right hand for right turns, and she did very well. So let's take a look at Faith. Keep in mind, this was 6 months after the evaluation. She hasn't driven for all that time. She's just trying to get into the chair now at school, and she does a fantastic job.
All right, this is Faith driving. She's got her forward switch behind her left arm that she's pushing right now to go straight ahead. And she's got a switch in her left hand for left turns. Can you show us a left turn, Faith?
Yeah.
There you go. Good job. And she's got the switch in her right hand for right turns. I know they're playing basketball or something in there, aren't they? Can you keep driving this way? You're doing great. And she's got a big old long mountain in front of her right now. We're going to move that out of the way. Excellent. Are you showing me the stuff on the wall? Look at all those pictures. Good job. Are you up there somewhere? You are. Good. And we're going to turn down that turn acceleration a little bit.
All right, so that was Faith driving the first time. And she was overshooting her turns a little, so we needed to make a few programming changes, but she's doing a really good job. All right. Next, we're going to look at another example, and this is Julian. Julian has spinal muscular atrophy. So whereas Faith has cerebral palsy with athetosis, a lot of uncontrolled movement and need for stability, Julian has profound muscle weakness, and his needs have changed over time. So he's been driving a power chair since he was 3, but as he has continued to lose muscle strength, we have had to change the position and the types of switches that he's had over the years. So we're going to take a look at our latest evaluation with him, and we'll see some videos as we move along. So in these first 2 videos, you'll see that we had determined in our evaluation that he could use proximities by either side of his head. He has used proximities for a while, but we had to move some of those other switches around. And in these videos, I'm simply asking him to turn his head so we can see exactly where the switches need to be.
Go.
There's going to be,
Good.
instead of that
And
kind
again?
of joystick, there's going to be
Perfect.
a really nice.
So that's the first switch placement. Now, it looks like he's moving fairly readily, but there's almost no force to his movement, and that's where the proximities come in handy because no force is required.
Go. Good. And again. Good.
So chair's not on yet. We're checking our final placement. We needed to adjust things a little bit for him. Now, he uses switches by either side of his head. He also uses fiber optics under each of his hands, under some of his specific fingers. So an index finger on one side, middle finger on the other. We have allowed his hands to be flexed over the edge of his arm troughs, specifically the hand pad at the end of his arm troughs, because with his fingers flexed, he has a little more movement. When he was younger, he was able to access switches directly under his fingers on a flat surface, but he's lost that ability. So in these videos, we don't have the fiber optics placed yet. We're simply looking at where they need to be.
Go. Good.
That big thing that's
And
stuck in
again?
the front, remember that?
Perfect.
And it kept hitting.
Go. Good. And again. Perfect.
Okay. So this is all part of the evaluation. We already knew that Julian was a great driver. We just needed to figure out exactly where we were going to put all these switches. So next you'll see a video of Julian driving. He's just gotten his newer power wheelchair. He's now at this stage freshman in college, and he's driving around outside of his apartment complex. One of his hands is not by the switch yet. I think it's laying in his lap because that's his reset switch, and we just wanted him to practice driving for a moment. On his right hand, you'll see he has a splint on his wrist. The only reason for that is his wrist has started to deviate to the side. We need to keep his wrist straight to keep his finger in alignment with his fiber optic switch so that he can consistently reach it. He's using a very, very small movement. So let's watch this video of Julian.
Forward. All right, now come forward. All right, turn. Don't run me over. Why are you chasing me? Okay, face me.
And and that's Julian's mom there. Julian has been vent dependent since about 1 year of age, so a long time. All right. So in both of those cases, Faith and Julian, we've used 4 different switches. In Julian's case, there was a combination of proximity switches and fiber optics. In Faith's situation, she was able to use all mechanical switches. But sometimes you might be working with a client where, despite your best efforts, you can only find 3 spots to put a switch. Well, what do? We can use these switches for forward, left, and right, and we can add a reverse or reset switch later if we can develop a switch site, or we can consider a feature called standby that allows someone to access all the features of their chair with only 3 switches. If a client can only use 2 body sites, 2 switches to control driving, we have a few options as well. So Adaptive Switch Labs, ASL, has a 2-switch fiber optic array. We can do something similar with Stealth. They have a line of alternative driving methods called iDrive. They have a feature called Link. In both, let me get my arrow here again. In both the Link feature of iDrive and the 2-switch fiber optic array, how this works is if the client covers 2 switches at the same time, these are fiber optics, with 1 finger, it acts as forward. If the client only covers left, the chair goes to the left. If they only cover right, the chair goes to the right. Now they would need another strategy to control other features of the chair. If they can control a 3rd switch, this can act as a reset. Now the client can cover both of these again for reverse, reset, and use one of these switches to get to other features such as power tilt, communication device, all sorts of things. So this is an option for 2-switch control. QLogic, which is the electronics package on quantum rehab chairs, has a 2-switch feature. It's a little difficult to use, but it allows the client to use 2 switches to emulate 4. And then finally, Adaptive Switch Labs, ASL, also has this single switch scanner with dual switch step scan. And what that means is with 1 switch, the client, this is the display that the client would look at, with 1 switch, they would move through potential directions with 1 switch, forward, right, reverse, left. When they got to the direction desired, they would hit their 2nd switch and hold it to move the chair in that direction for as long as switch contact is sustained. You could guess any of these methods are a bit tedious to use, but it does provide some options for people who can only control 2 switches. And then finally, we do have an option for clients who can only control a switch at 1 location, and this is scanning. In this case, 1 switch is hit just 1 time momentarily, and these directions are automatically scanned rather than a step scan. When the direction I want comes along, I hit and hold my switch to move in that direction, release, and the scan starts again. There are some newer options to provide a larger display, to allow for some auditory feedback. It's a beep for clients who might have some difficulty seeing this display. It's a very tedious way of driving. The first thing I try to do if I see someone who's using single switch scanning is to find a couple more switch sites. But if we can't, it is a method of driving. So I'm going to bring you through a little bit more information, and then I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions, because this group always asks lots of really awesome questions. So don't worry, we're not finishing yet, but here's our take-home message. There are a lot of ways to drive a power chair. Hopefully this webinar has shown some of that, as well as the resources that you have. Positioning, drive wheel configuration, tracking, programming, training, all of these are very, very critical in optimizing driving for an individual. And I think there's a lot of folks out there who really could be successful in driving a power wheelchair, but perhaps haven't had one of these areas addressed, or perhaps just simply hasn't had the opportunity to try their optimal driving method. On my website, which is listed here, there's a number of different resources that might be helpful. You should have the top 2 in your handouts, but if you lose track of them, feel free to grab these, and hopefully that will be helpful to you. And then finally, I mentioned this earlier, there's a resource that just came out last year, Seating and Wheeled Mobility, a clinical resource guide. It's available from Slack, and I had the privilege of editing this along with Jean Minkle, and we have a whole slew of authors who are just all specialists in the field that contributed this huge amount of information. There is a chapter, an entire chapter on alternative driving methods in this book, as well as advanced power wheelchair features is a second chapter. So if this is really an interest area of yours, this might be something you consider looking into. So I want to thank you very much for attending this, and I want to make sure we have time to get to questions. So questions or comments, this is a great time to type those in now. While we're waiting for people to type those in, I want to remind you that this is all complex rehab technology, CRT. And so this is the type of equipment that isn't ordered by the small little durable medical equipment supplier in the strip mall. This is equipment that requires someone who has specific training and typically has a credential or certification, called the APP through RESNA. So it's important to work with a larger supplier who specializes in this area, and they are a critical part of the team. Corey has asked about the handouts. Yes, the handouts were sent to you, and they'll be sent to you in a follow-up email after the webinar. I think some of the emails bounced, so if you want, you can put your email into the chat box, and Deb will make sure she gets you a copy of the handouts. Again, you can also find some on my website. All right, so Claire has said, for someone who uses switches for an augmentative communication device, which is touch and release, are there options for a similar operation for power wheelchair control? Also, if the AAC switches are on the right side, do you have any suggestions for placing switches for driving so they are accessible and don't conflict? All right, so let's say you have someone who's already using switches for their communication device, and you use plural, so I'm guessing that they're doing 2-switch scanning. When you're using switches for communication, it is very different than for driving. With communication, you hit the switch momentarily and you release. With driving, you hold the switch down for a certain amount of time and you release to stop. So it's almost the opposite motor pattern. You need sustained activation rather than momentary activation. So this is challenging for using the 2 switches in the same way. It is possible through technology called interfacing to use the switches that control the communication device in the same switches and same locations to also drive. Actually, the switches will primarily be used for driving the power chair. The driver can place the chair in a different mode of operation and send those switch signals somewhere else through an interfacing cable that then plugs into the communication device. So it is possible to do, but we would only have 2 switches at that point. You need to try to find 2 other switches for the client. You mentioned too, Claire, in your question that the switches that the client's already using for communication are on the right side, and we don't want to conflict if we're looking at switch placement for driving. That's another reason sometimes we want to interface, because we don't want to compromise someone's ability to drive because their best switch sites are being used for something else. And sometimes there's just simply not the room or the ability to hit that many switches to control communication and driving separately. Again, I would encourage you to get more information about interfacing, and there are some other webinars, I believe, in the AbleNet webinar library you can look at, and I might have some other resources you can look at on my website as well. All right, thank you for your comment, Heidi. Appreciate that. Okay, any other questions or comments at this point? Again, this is a lot of information and information that we sometimes go through over a longer time period if we were face-to-face. While people are typing, I would also greatly encourage you, depending on your role on the team and your interest in these driving methods, is to try to have an opportunity to actually hop in these chairs and drive with a variety of these driving methods. It's very difficult for me to determine if someone can use a driving method if I haven't had a chance to drive it myself. Then I have a much better appreciation for that, as well as how to train someone how to use it. We have another question from Claire saying you did not mention attendant controls. Is there information available on your website on this? Not specific information on my website about attendant controls, but whenever someone's using an alternative driving method, an attendant control can be very important so that caregivers can take over and drive the chair. Let's say with Julian's situation, he has proximity switches and fiber optics. His mom does not drive with those. She has a joystick on the back that she uses. And that can be helpful if the driver can't get into a more difficult driving situation, like perhaps driving up a ramp and lining up with tie downs in a van, or if the driver is having a medical issue or is just really tired. It can be very difficult to get funding for attendant controls. It's important that part of our justification includes that the caregiver cannot realistically use the alternative driving method that the client is using. So I hope that's helpful. I'll make sure you have my contact information. We still have another couple minutes. If anyone has any questions or comments, this is a great time to ask them. Again, while people are typing anything in there, I know a real common question people often have is, how do I determine if this client's ready, if they are going to understand the task of driving? We do have, again, other webinars on that in the ABLEnet library on how to determine if that first-time driver is ready for this task, and if they're not yet ready, how to develop those skills. So determining readiness and also developing readiness so that a client can eventually move towards successfully using a power chair. Very, very important stuff so that people who otherwise wouldn't have a chance to be independent and mobility can be so. Okay, Susan has said, my patient's most consistent movements are reflexive and interfere with visual regard extension. So, yeah, you know, if, thank you, Kristen, for your comment. A lot of our clients with high tone who have cerebral palsy also have reflexive movements, such as that dreaded ATNR, and so it can really affect their ability to access their switches, and it can pull the head to the side, and then the client can't see in front of them. That's a challenge. So in those cases, we need to get back to that basic switch assessment. How do we determine where a client can activate a switch where they're not using reflexive movements, if possible, and where we can put a switch and position the client so they're least likely to set off those reflexes. Now, we can't make those reflexes go away, but I think there are positions that can be determined that help minimize that and that allow someone to have better control. I see a lot of clients where someone's put a switch right in line with a reflex, and the client, even if they can hit it, has a lot of difficulty coming off of that switch, and that could be a problem. So again, I would refer you to those switch assessment webinars, but great question, Susan, thank you. Well, we're at the top of the hour, and I know people have lots of busy things in their schedule, so we're going to go ahead and wrap up this webinar. I do truly hope it was helpful to you and to the clients that you serve, and I thank you again for attending. We hope to see you all at the next ABLEnet webinar.